special coverage, and I am joined by a former chief of staff to Bob Mueller himself, an investigative reporter who helped break some of the very stories that Michael Cohen told under oath tonight. I'm going to speak to both of you in a second. Let me explain what we're turning to now. You have the unusual situation of the president's former lawyer releasing this and explaining its evidence that Donald Trump committed crimes in office. It's the Stormy Daniels reimbursement check. And when you have it, this is now all over the country. We saw it in the committee room. We have it here in our newsroom. This is not a jumbo check for some sort of charity auction. This is Donald Trump's personal bank account. This is what proves to the public that Cohen was telling the truth, at least about this, and how he wanted to cover up alleged contact with women in 2016. Now, again, we'll put it up. You have the signature of then-candidate Trump and the date, then President Trump, August 1st, 2017, because he paid this from candidacy into presidency. Cohen also supplied a second check, $35,000, also signed by Donald Trump Jr. and the Trump Org Chief Financial Officer, Alan Weisberg.
I was involved in several of these catch and kill episodes. He asked me to pay off an adult film star with whom he had an affair. He was concerned with the effect that it had had on the campaign. He had told me that he had spoken to a couple of friends, and it's $130,000. It's not a lot of money, and we should just do it. Everything had to go through Mr. Trump. Well, he knew about everything, yes.
What did the president ask or suggest that you say about the payments?
He was not knowledgeable of these reimbursements, and he wasn't knowledgeable of my actions to keep him far away from it as possible.
Cohen's evidence and testimony proves that Donald Trump lied for so long about this. Part of that we knew, but it also raises important new questions about how all that went down.
A check sent while President Trump was in office with Donald Trump's signature on it to reimburse Mr. Cohen for the hush money payment. 6 months later, the president denied anything about it. Is there any doubt in your mind that President Trump knew exactly what he was paying for?
There is no doubt in my mind.
For special coverage, we're joined by New York Times investigative reporter Megan Twohey, who covered AMI's dealings with Michael Cohen extensively, what he was just discussing, and John Carlin, former chief of staff and counsel to Robert Mueller from the FBI. Let's start there because, John, this was something Mueller uncovered in his deep investigative work and then famously handed off to New York. Do you think Mueller understood this would be a potential outcome, what has now exploded and then came out today on the Hill?
Well, it's interesting. Look, I think Bob Mueller, as he does, followed his mandate carefully, saw where the facts were leading, saw evidence of a crime, used the referral that had been given to him that said if it's outside the scope of what you're investigating it, you should give it to another investigator, did so, and watched as the excellent career prosecutors and investigators in the Southern District of New York and FBI followed up and revealed multiple crimes. Then, going back to a story you covered earlier, you have Michael Cohen flipping, providing additional evidence, and some of that evidence is quite relevant to the core of what Mueller is investigating, and that is connections between individuals affiliated with the campaign like Stone with an organization, WikiLeaks, that the president's current Secretary of State and former head of the CIA has referred to as a non-state hostile intelligence operation. And according to the revealing testimony today that prosecutors must have known about already, but it was new to us, is that Michael Cohen says he overheard a conversation directly tying the President of the United States to information coming from that hostile non-state intelligence
that caught your ear as well? I'm going to go to Megan in a moment on her reporting that led to all this, but since you bring it up and since you worked directly for Mueller, if, as you say, that account, which is consistent with allegations in the Roger Stone indictment, bears out, and if Donald Trump privately doubled down on what he claimed publicly, which was rebutting that, how would Bob Mueller view that kind of lie in an interrogatory? Would he let it slide?
That would be extraordinarily significant if it's true. And then the other question would be, can you corroborate so you have more than the word of just Michael Cohen when it comes to the way a prosecutor would review it? But remember, at the end of the day, if the interpretation of the Office of Legal Counsel stands,
sure,
the president can't be indicted.
So if he can't be
ultimately,
indicted and there is that interrogatory, is that something that Mueller says to DOJ? Congress has got to see that. That's not something we're just going to bury inside Main Justice.
That's exactly where I was going. All right, for the part of the rationale of the OLC opinion that says that a president can't be prosecuted, it doesn't say that a president is king or above the law.
Sure.
It says we have another mechanism to resolve it, and that is Congress. And for that to have any weight, that would mean there has to be a way for Congress to get the relevant information.
Right. So a lot of people talk about Mueller. You worked with him. You're saying he would make sure Congress got it. Do you think the evidence points to Trump lying on that answer to Mueller?
That I have no, I don't know. I know that you're reporting what another news organization said, but I have no idea what he actually what he said.
Well, I just had to ask you, Megan.
Yeah.
Walk us through this since your reporting has kicked so much of it off. What was important to you when you saw the hearing?
Well, I would begin by saying that I've been one of many reporters at the New York Times who have reported on these issues, and there's also been fantastic reporting by the Wall Street Journal and the Associated Press. So I just want to start with that. But
let me make sure I understand. We're tight on time. You're an investigative boss and also humble.
Yeah, well, no, I do think it's important, and I do think it's just been remarkable that there were so many reporters that were going after this story. And I think that, so listen, we knew that Trump made we knew that Trump made this hush payment to Stormy Daniels. We knew that it amounted to a violation of a criminal campaign violation. We knew that was done at the direction of individual one, President Trump. But today we got a lot more details and a lot more color. One, we learned that there were, for the first time, Don Jr. and Alan Weisselberg, the CFO of the Trump Organization, were identified as people who were involved in the reimbursements to Cohen for that. So that was significant. That was a significant detail that came out.
Plain English, does that mean they were directly involved in the misuse of corporate funds?
I think that it raises questions about whether or not they were complicit in this conspiracy to influence the outcome of the election.
And does it suggest this was routine? Like, hey, just give Michael some money, don't ask any questions, extra legal services money. He already works there.
Yeah, I mean, what the federal prosecutors had already described these as sham invoices, that this has been part of, that there was this sort of original conspiracy to do this hush payment to help influence the election, and then there was a whole system that was created afterwards for the reimbursement that involved sham invoices. So it's clear also that the Southern District of New York is continuing to investigate these things. We also learned that Trump's involvement in this stretched into 2018, right? That he wasn't just involved in the conversations on the front end in terms of deciding what they were going to do with this hush payment, that as late as 2018, he was calling Cohen and saying, listen, lie to reporters about my involvement in this. So that was another key thing. And then we also had these incredible visuals. We had these checks that Cohen, arrived with, not just the one from Trump that was signed by Trump himself, but also one that was signed by Don Jr. and Alan Weisselberg.
Right, you're name checking the family. This does change things. There may be people who are skeptical of Cohen. There may be things you can say you don't believe him on. This is a Donald Trump check.
Right, that's exactly right. And so while I think the existence of these checks, at least the Trump check had been known, it's another thing to see them visually.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.